Recordings in progress. You hear that?
Mm-hmm. Splendid.
All right. So don't say anything that you might later regret. All right. It's my pleasure to welcome Julian Vayne on the podcast. Julian, little background before we get started. I've seen you around the psychedelic and magic scene. I've seen some videos of yours over the years. You've done a lot of presentations at different places. But recently you're on my friend Jason's podcast. And I really appreciated a lot of what you had to say. I appreciated that you're a fellow practitioner. So I think that gives you and I a different perspective than maybe an academic or a clinician when thinking about psychedelics and their therapeutic use. And I just thought you're one of, you're a spiritual kin. You're an interesting person who's explored a lot in your life. And I just wanted to really talk to you and dig into some interesting topics. So thanks for joining me.
Brian, thank you very, very much for inviting me. It's really lovely to be here, and looking forward to unfolding an interesting conversation with you today.
Great. Maybe you could start by letting us know, where in the world are you?
So I'm speaking to you from North Devon. So if you visualize a map of the British Isles, the little archipelago off of the main body of continental Europe, and you visualize that map, then you've got down in the southwest corner of the island, you have Cornwall, which I guess lots of people have heard of, and then Devon is the next region up. So it's a fairly kind of rural region. I'm in a town of about, 20,000 people, something of this order. I'm within a matter of a couple of miles walk from the coast. I live in the valley with an enormous river that passes through it with a great tidal range of about 7-8 meters, something like this. And that's where my home has been for getting on for 20 years now.
Sounds great. And not dissimilar from where I live here on Vancouver Island. We've got the ocean out the back door, a beautiful lake I love to swim in just down the path, and mountains on the island and coastal rainforest. So we're in natural places, which is nice.
Yeah, it's really important for me. I mean, I've lived in various cities, Bristol and Brighton and Leeds, and I spend a fair amount of time when it's not being a pandemic in London. So being able to kind of come back to my home and to be able to spend time in, for want of better words, like a natural environment is really, really kind of essential. It's one of the things that I think, for me, it's a real source of spiritual nourishment to be in those spaces. Yeah, really important for my own well-being, I guess.
Yeah, I'm with you. My wife and I, we tried moving back to a bigger city a couple of years ago. We got kind of priced out of the rental market here on the island at the time. And so we just decided, well, let's try Montreal for a while. It's one of the world's great cities, I think. Definitely, one of the oldest, most interesting cities in North America. A lot of great old Catholic churches and lots of arts and culture. So we moved back and we spent a couple of years there, but I realized pretty quickly on that I'd kind of outgrown the city. Like, I love to visit the city and feel the creative juices and get kind of inspired that way. But really, I need to live in a more natural place for my spiritual and physical well-being these days.
Exactly the same. Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting. Over the past 6 months, I probably interviewed 2 or 3 people from Devon. So Martin Shaw, who's a mythologist and storyteller, and Tom Hirons, who's another storyteller type and bookmaker. So there's some kind of psychic connection happening between Vancouver Island and the British Isle.
Well, man, the West is the best. So I guess that's the way it rolls.
Yeah, maybe all us weirdos just go west as far as we can. Stop there and make a life for ourselves.
Yeah, it's exactly like that whole kind of like the notion, or be it one that is historically questionable, of the Celtic peoples, for want of better terms, kind of all ending up being pushed down into kind of Cornwall, Wales, that kind of region, and certainly it's a space which definitely in the British Isles, and I'm sure they're in Canada as well. You know, that it's rich with the magic of the landscape, both the magic that's been written into by our ancestors in the form of stone circles and chamber tombs and so on, and also just having access to the wide vista of the ocean. I think that's really kind of helpful. It helps me put things in perspective. You know, there's the everyday stuff going on, emails to write, bills to pay, whatever. There's the ocean, just being the ocean, the way it's been for quite a considerable period of time. And yeah, it just kind of, I think, allows me to triangulate and locate my own difficulties within this bigger vista. And they don't seem so great when I'm presented with the sea there in front of me.
Yeah, definitely puts things in perspective.
Mm-hmm.
The sea endures.
Yeah.
She's seen it all pretty much, you know.
Yeah.
I'm interested. It's not a question I usually ask, but I'm really interested to hear what you were like as a kid.
Okay, so I mean, I was interested in magic and the occult and weird stuff from basically as long as I can remember. So I remember going to. I grew up in what's called a new town, so a town that was founded essentially after World War II as a place that people who had been bombed out of, particularly the East End of London and various other places, could be rehoused. So I grew up in this space which was on the one hand very kind of suburban, lots of new buildings and so on, but also had a very old heart. So the school that I went to was founded in 1558, although at the time, you know, when I went there, it was just like a standard kind of state school, you know, nothing fancy. But I was always kind of really intrigued by magic, and I suppose I kind of, you know, I had friends, I did stuff, hung out, whatever. But I also spent an inordinate amount of time lurking around in the library, where I managed to get hold of all kinds of entertaining texts. I think one of the most significant ones for me was a book by an author called John Simmons, who wrote a book called The Great Beast, which is the story of one of I think the first biography of Aleister Crowley. Not a terribly complimentary biography, but nevertheless one that I read and I just thought, this is amazing. This is like this dude, and he's like climbing mountains and, you know, doing all this astonishing stuff, and he's really into magic and drugs and all that kind of thing. And then very quickly I learned that there was a thing called interlibrary loan. So I could request a book that existed in some far-flung library, and eventually it would turn up with a note. So I remember requesting a thing called The Key of Solomon, and devouring that. And I spent a lot of time kind of going through anything I could lay my hands on that was to do with magic. And particularly I was fascinated by kind of technique. Like, okay, guys, there's all these funny words and all these strange sigils, and that's all kind of cool. But what do you do? Like, what do you do? And what's what you know? How does this stuff kind of operate? What's the mechanics of this magic that I'm so fascinated by? So I actually still have them. I've got a series of books which I started keeping when I was probably about like 13 onwards, where I would go through collections of folk spells and remedies. I would go through, you know, the more kind of hardcore Western Esoteric Tradition stuff, and I wrote down all of the techniques that I could find, all the methodology I could find, all the magic scripts I could find. I made lists of Hebrew letters and the gematria associated with those kinds of things. So I probably should have got out more and climbed more trees, I guess, on reflection. But hey, that's just what happened to me. And I didn't particularly come from a magical family. You know, my mum has got a little bit of an interest in kind of spiritualism and the esoteric in a very kind of gentle sort of a way. Both my parents really caring, lovely people, very happy for me to kind of do my stuff. Recognizing it was a bit weird. I think when I moved my bed out of my bedroom and took to sleeping on a mattress on the floor, and took up the carpet and painted a magic circle on the deck. I guess they kind of thought this is a bit weird. Luckily, it was before all the whole kind of, satanic abuse nonsense. And so like that, none of that stuff was problematic. But I was interested from a very, very kind of early age, even from, again, about the age of 13, 14 or so. I started going to, those kind of like magic fairs, magic festival things where you've got like a bunch of people reading tarot and someone selling incense and all that kind of stuff, and hanging out with these people. And I would tend to gravitate to the darkened corner where there were people dressed in black, burning heavy incense and looking mysterious, and sometimes receiving um, glances from some of the other people who were perhaps doing crystal readings, which suggested that they were not to be trusted. And those people I found the most fascinating. And so those are the people that I ended up hanging out with. And then when I was 16, I had the opportunity, with the consent of my parents, to join, to go and guest at a Wiccan coven, which I did. And that was amazing. And then by a really weird collection of circumstances, the second time that I went down, the second or third time that I went down for like a ritual, this is to London, some stuff happened which meant that there wasn't really anyone to kind of run the ritual and to do the role of the high priest. So I ended up doing it, because I was the one that knew the material better than anyone else, which was like insane.
The magical prodigy.
Yeah, man, it was pretty crazy. I'm kind of like pleased now that I've kind of made it to the grand old age of 52, and I can be the sort of the graying haired dude, at the back, because I spent a long time as like, always the youngest member of the group and so on. But I did get an opportunity to meet all kinds of like, interesting and cool people. And to be involved with, I guess, the scene, the culture. I'm the kind of person I really like collaborating with other people. I really like working with other people. So working in kind of magical group contexts, working as part of community. I've written loads of books, but actually, if you look at most, something like 50% of the books that I've written are co-authored. So I really, really like kind of working with other people. So finding what felt like, however imperfectly, my community was really, really valuable, particularly for this kind of, little bespectacled kid from the suburbs, who had no lineage, no story, no reason to kind of want to do this stuff other than a really passionate interest.
Yeah, I can relate. I mean, I come from a blue collar working class family. The only books in our house were, that delved into the weird were like Stephen King books. My mom was a big Stephen King fan, and she would secretly feed me the books when she was done with them, because I was a really precocious reader. And like you, I haunted the library, and I had to get my mom to write a note so that I could take out some adult books when I was 11 and 12. And yeah, going through all those old, I think they were put out by Time Life Books, but a collection of books on the occult and all the esoteric practices. I was just completely fascinated by that stuff, but it bubbled up seemingly out of nowhere, and gave me my first insight into this idea that we're born into this life with like what James Tillman refers to as the soul's code, that there's something in us that knows exactly what we're supposed to do and who we're supposed to be. I'm wondering, how you feel about that. Where do you see this stuff, this impulse toward the esoteric? Where do you think it comes from?
I don't know. It's a very interesting question. The short answer is I don't know. The longer answer, I guess, is that I feel like some of those ideas from Hillman and co. And people like Viktor Frankl, that are, for me, it's like the purpose, this act of making meaning in the world. We're born, and for many of us, I guess, in sort of, Euro-American kind of culture, we soon realize that life these days is structured in a way that there is no, certainly from the background I had, like overarching religious or even political kind of ideology. So we have to, we're rather like the actor all alone, in the words of Jim Morrison, thrown out on the stage. We've got to make this stuff up. We've got to figure something out. And so for me, the act of meaning making and perhaps of soul creation, soul nourishment and nurture it just happens to be, in my case, that I identify primarily as a magician or an occultist, or, you know, none of these words are really perfect. Occultist is the one I go for. It's fairly relatively neutral in some respects, and that's just who I am. Some people, their meaning-making soul creation process expresses itself as art or as caregiving or as, you know, whatever it happens to be. And obviously, we can have different aspects of our personality and our life that kind of comes up as we go through this incarnation. But very much for me, it felt like, I don't know. I mean, you know, if I'm being romantic about it, maybe it's a vocation. Maybe it's even some kind of reincarnatory stuff. I have no idea. I have no idea. I do remember kind of encountering some of the first Wiccan material that I read, and kind of having this real sense of like a resonance with this, whether that was a kind of poetic resonance or whether that was some kind of, you know, other process that's going on. I don't know, but there was a sense in which, like, this is my thing. This is my thing. You know, I guess it's like people who are perhaps, you know, athletes or great sports people or whatever, that they discover the thing, and that may be purely a kind of circumstantial combination of things that lead to that discovery. Some people maybe only discover those things when they're in, you know, way advanced in their life journey. But for me, it was pretty early on. And like you, and, you know, I spoke to lots of other people. I remember talking, I think it was Richard Kaczynski that I was talking to, and he was exactly the same. It was like, yeah, there's a number of people, I think, who become interested in the esoteric at different phases of their lives, perhaps when they've gone through, I don't know, a big relationship reconfiguration or a bereavement or some other process that invites them to ask more searching questions about what does this all mean. But for me, that was pretty early on. It was pretty early on. And I started doing the practices as well, because that was the thing that really fascinated me, was that I soon realized that you can set dress this stuff with loads of different language depending on your cultural envelope, but there seemed to be some kind of underlying processes at work. And so I started doing yoga. I think from like the one esoteric book my mum had, which was like one of these yoga things that was like on the TV in the 70s, you know, like learn to do yoga. Here's some pictures of people. So I kind of started working through that when I was about, maybe 10, something of this order, and kind of getting into that. And that's a practice that stayed with me, you know, for the next, 40 years, basically. And meditation practices, I'd find something in the book and I'd try it out as far as I was able, you know, because it's like I kind of figured that a lot of this kind of occult stuff kind of said, well, you know, you can study and you can learn, but fundamentally it's about like the practice. It's about like a doing, and that, I guess, was one of the things that really interested me when I started kind of hearing about things like chaos magic. As a style, and although I didn't kind of get involved in practitioners who were working in that way for quite some time, the notion that you could find these underlying structures or technologies, and that what mattered most was applying these, exploring them for yourself, that kind of Gnostic idea that, like, you know, magic is not about some dude telling you a bunch of, this is how it is, Brian, this is how it works, you know, this is the way, the truth, and the light. It's like, no, dude, fundamentally, you've got to do the stuff, you've got to evaluate it for yourself. Yes, you do that within a peer group setting, within a Sangha, within a community. You've got to have that. You've got to have points of triangulation and bouncing back, and people telling you, no, you've definitely gone too far now. You need to rein this back in and do something else. But really, it's about the doing. And that's the thing that I found most, really inspiring, and that I could do it, you know, like, meditation ain't no supplies necessary for the basic vanilla flavor, you know, just got to have somewhere to sit, pretty much. That's it, you know. So it was very accessible as a child, for me. And I think I remember doing my first kind of big ritual. Well, I know exactly when it was. I was 15, and it was Halloween, and I did a big kind of invocation to Set, because Set was like, you know, cool and dark side and amazing and like all this kind of thing, and did this big ritual, nearly burnt down the house, but that's another story. But yeah, it was amazing. I could do this stuff. I could practice this stuff, and I could explore it. And that was the thing that really fascinated me and fired me up.
Yeah, same for me too. I mean, I was always interested in kind of reading about the history of things, and I loved kind of the kind of mystical journey autobiography, where it's like part travelogue, part mystical adventure. I always loved that kind of stuff. But really early on, like you, I was really interested in practice because I wanted to experience it myself. And like you, that's led me to follow a lot of different threads throughout my life. Yoga, shamanism, psychedelics, psychology, even I would put in there. And, now that I'm in my mid 40s, been doing this for a while, I'm most interested in what is the kind of commonality between these things. Because I think at their essence, they're all getting to a similar thing. And I'm really curious if you've also found that, like, do you think that there's a common element to all these varied practices?
I think that there are several strands that we could pull out. I think one is um, the relationship with the fact that we're embodied beings. So if you think of something like a banishing ritual, like the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, or the variants that have flowed from that Golden Dawn ritual, the Gnostic pentagram ritual, and so on. Fundamentally, what those are about is they're about up, down, forward, back, right, and left. Yeah. So they're orientation exercises. So that banishing ritual is a way of orientating ourselves in space. I often say if we were starfish, we'd have different banishing rituals. We'd have like ones based on 5 or 10 or whatever. So part of it is to do with the body. And if we look at things like even psychology, there's a way, we might, for example, read the unconscious as the body in some sense, our interoceptive ability, the fact that you and I are having this conversation, we're not having to worry about respiration or peristalsis or the circulatory system or anything. It's all just happening. So we can think of the body as a really important kind of location for this stuff. And when we talk about the body, and of course we have this problematic stuff in our language about like body and mind, like these are two separate things, which is completely crazy talk. But when we think about the mind, we think about this. We've got this idea of the imagination, and for me, I like to kind of summarize at least one important element of magic as being magic is the technology of the imagination. So it's a way of skillfully deploying the imagination to create changes internally and externally. So we use our capacity to imagine things to make these alterations in physical body structure through technique, connected breath, holotropic breath work, for example. And we can use our skill and the knowledge that we can acquire either through personal experiment or we can learn from others to skillfully alter the way things work in the inner and outer world. So, for example, we know that when we're stressed, we breathe fast, we breathe high in the chest and so on. And we also know that, or we may know, and we may be told or reminded that actually, if we want to kind of chill out and relax and come down a notch to deal with whatever's going on, the best strategy is to slow and deepen our breath. So we have like a skillful means, we have a skillful technique, which I can tell to you, you can tell to me, and I can go, oh, cool. And maybe I can remember that at the appropriate moment. So I can kind of, the word control is always slightly problematic here, but I can
You can affect.
I can affect, yeah, and I can intervene in what's going on. And the fact that we know that the imagination is perhaps a location in which we can misconstrue things, misunderstand things, be fooled. The same quality of the imagination is also the quality that gives it the power. So if you take placebo effect as an example, which is this kind of throwaway thing, so important that we have to correct against it in drug trials. Nevertheless, the fact of placebo, which we could think of as simply, and this is often how people kind of talk about it, is like it's like fooling yourself. It's like, yes, it is fooling yourself. And by doing so in an appropriate and carefully kind of orchestrated way, you can create real material changes in the inner and outer worlds. So we can use the slippery nature of the imagination. We can use the remarkable capacity that we have with our cognition to take that malleable kind of quality and do really important, useful, and beneficial things with it. We take shamanism, for example. Okay, so I lie down, I'm the patient, something's going on for me. Maybe I have a psychedelic in me, maybe I don't, maybe you do, maybe you're the shaman, you're the facilitator, whatever words we want to use. And you pull something out of me. Yeah, you use the smoke, you use the feathers, like whatever trappings are going on, and something is removed from me. Now, it doesn't matter about the kind of the ontological reality or otherwise of the thing that is removed. The thing in the imaginal space is happening, and that can lead to healing, unblocking of creative possibility, deeper knowledge about ourselves and our relationship with the world, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's a bit of it, I guess.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that you put imagination at the center of that magic is imaginal technique to influence or affect our internal state and possibly the external world around us. That's really where I've come to as well. And a real focus of my work is helping people re-enliven their imagination, because I think one of the biggest problems I see is that people's imaginations have kind of become atrophied in this modern culture where we're inundated with images all of the time, like, and usually images meant to sell us on something or make us feel a particular way. Like the advertisers are the modern shaman. And I can say that as someone who worked in advertising for about 10 or 12 years. It was just a misuse of my powers, and it took me a while to realize that. The money was too good. But I really see that as central to everything that I do. So in yoga, in kind of classical yoga, imagination is really central. You talk about a banishing ritual in magic, and I immediately think about the kind of pranayama I was taught, where you're visualizing, inhaling golden light, filling your whole body, permeating your cells, and then breathing out like a dark smoke. So it's like a ritual, imaginative cleansing. In shamanism, kind of core shamanism, what I think of as archetypal shamanism, using simply a drum to induce a trance state, we're engaging with our imagination and kind of seeing where it takes us. And then revealing all this stuff from our unconscious. So imagination is really, really core.
And in both of those examples, both the idea of doing that, the technique that I remember learning this as, I think it was called light breathing, where you were sort of, breathing in the light, breathing out the stuff that no longer serves you. But also what you're doing is you're as you breathe in, you're recognizing that you're visualizing perhaps all the golden light or bright clear light, whatever it is, kind of flowing through you, and that is what your breath is actually doing. Like that's actually happening.
Yeah.
Like all of the oxygenation is passing through, like all the stuff. So you're also kind of bringing an awareness to something that is actually indeed the case. Indeed the case. And likewise with the drum is the percussive vibration, which has all of those kind of effects on all the various kind of systems of the body. So it's often about, like, one of the things about magic for me is this kind of, it points towards the alchemical idea of, like, you're working with the most rarefied and slippery of things, the imagination, and also the most physical material of stuff, the bodies that we perceive ourselves as inhabiting, often separate beings. And we're using those two kind of levers, those two aspects essentially of the same thing, to affect those changes. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, totally. Sometimes I just think about it as bringing the mind into engagement with reality through the imagination. Like you said, when I'm imagining the golden light, I'm also like actually experiencing the enlivening effect in my physical being. As I breathe more deeply, nervous system calms down. Maybe I feel tingling through my limbs. I definitely get a little high from the breath sometimes, So yeah, there's that. It's the as above, so below, as within, so without in practice.
Yeah.
And I think that's what all of these practices, techniques have in common. Yeah.
And that's, I guess that's also where we get to the thing with psychedelics, which are so fascinating as an agent or a technique or an approach within this, because they also echo the same thing. Like when we talk, we talk about, we take a psychedelic, and we have this kind of like all these, psychological, imaginal kind of experiences. And it's a physical material with physical chemistry going into a physical body. And so it's, again, as above, so below, the lead transformed into the gold of enlightenment in an ideal world. And also the gold of enlightenment that then flows back into the body and allows us to perhaps change our behaviors in terms of, I don't know, what we eat, or like how we are in the world, what our relationships are like, what we do with our sleep pattern, all kinds of really kind of practical stuff. So yeah, as above, so below. You know, like Hermes thrice great says, it's just, that's the way it is. It would seem to me.
Yeah. And I think really you could read a statement like that a million times, and you could hear all this stuff. But that's why I'm such a big proponent of practice. Like, just give it a try as a personal experiment. Try a real yoga practice for a month or two, just to see for yourself if there's something to it.
If you take the example of something like mindfulness meditation, and I know it's been critiqued, and people kind of talk about the problematic side of it.
Well,
Blah,
that's
blah,
just
blah.
kind of boring.
Yeah, well, that's part of the challenge and the entertainment of it, the vanilla flavor. But there you go. Like, you do 20 minutes of mindfulness for 6 weeks every day. You can see the difference in an fMRI scanner between the brain at the beginning and the brain at the end of the process. You can see the difference in the relationship between the amygdala and the hippocampus, and like, it's a thing. Like, so the internal imaginal process has these material reflections in the physical substrate of the brain, in the same way that when we have psychedelics, and they provide us with these new insights at the physical level of the brain, what's happening is that the default mode network is being turned down, and all these other pieces of connectivity and these novelties and is emerging, and these new neuronal connections exist in the hardware, if you like, or the wetware, and that arises into awareness as, I see it differently now. I get it. It's like, I see another way of seeing through this problem, or I have a new way to sit with the trauma that perhaps I've experienced. The trauma doesn't go away, but there's a new meta level that kind of comes in that allows us to deal with that in a better way.
Mm. And I think even more than the kind of neural connections that may be made is something of the transcendent experience that puts its ego in its right place. And my yoga guru would always say, you got to make the heart the boss and the mind its dutiful servant. And it kind of inverts the kind of modern Western hierarchical structure, where it puts the mind first, and even kind of getting the term wrong when we talk about psychedelics. It was always translated as manifesting the mind, but it means manifesting the soul or revealing the soul. We're so mind centric that it's like all about mind. And Michael Pollan's book, Change Your Mind, and it's all about the mind. Well, I think the mind changes when it realizes that it's not the only occupant of this meat body. And maybe it's not even primary.
And we certainly notice that, don't we? I mean, we certainly notice that in terms of when we do body work or body mind work, and we do yoga, qigong, any of these kind of practices. I mean, I do some work for the National Health Service, and I do kind of sessions which are, they're not billed as magic at all. They're billed as well-being, right? And a lot of the techniques are basically the same kind of stuff. And one of the things I do with people at the beginning of the session is I say, stand up, feel how your body feels, feel how your mind feels, feel how you feel, like the whole of you. Right, now do a little bit of stretching. Now recalibrate that again. How do you feel? Is it any better? Is it any different? Okay, so now we do some other practices, and we kind of stop, as we go through this, and just go, oh, how is it now? How is it now? How is it now? And I think that over the course of the next few years, we're going to see a real development of interest in the way that of starting to really see ourselves again away from this kind of Descartian idea of like, you know, there's the soul and then there's the pineal gland and I don't know, some magic thread that connects this stuff together. Who knows? We'll see a lot more emphasis on the inhabited inhabited body. You know, I really like things like philosophy and the writing that comes out of phenomenology, which is all about that kind of embodied experience. You know, really, really important stuff. When we look at psychedelics, we, as you absolutely completely correctly say, we talk about the mind an awful lot. But I suspect over the next few years, we'll start to see, oh, that's what it does to the flora in the gut. Oh, so that's what it does to the fascia tissue. Oh, so that's how it works. And I think there's a lot of interesting work. I saw some work on uh, sort of deep analysis of the vagus nerve, for instance, this remarkable structure that rather like the serpent of wisdom in the Kabbalah, you know, seems to kind of like touch in on almost every kind of structure in the body.
Yeah,
And
I call it the information superhighway of the body.
exactly. So like, and starting to collapse down this thing about like mind and body. So we talk about body mind or whatever language is going to emerge. That's going to be really, really crucial, especially as we go through this kind of, you know, the experience of the pandemic. People realizing that the relationship between what we call mind and body, it is essentially the same thing. There is our experience of being in the world, as the phenomenologists would call it, and that's what we ultimately need to be talking about. And then when we address these things in terms of, say, a therapeutic modality, I suspect that what we will find over the next few years some really interesting stuff, which is just bubbling up now, about body work and psychedelics. You know, so for example, we know that people who have a dissociative disorder, we're going to medicalize it. We know that those people often have quite a difficult time letting go enough in order for a psychedelic experience to unfold for them. Yeah. So I mean, you know, I've know of and have seen people take actually what theoretically would be, you know, the kind of doses of something like psilocybin that should stop a charging elephant, and it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is because the whole of their, you know, parasympathetic nervous system is in this kind of freeze mode. So all you have to do with those people is give them a lower dose, take them for a walk, because you can't go into that mode while you're walking. Yeah, it just doesn't work. The physiology doesn't allow for that. If you're lying down with the headphones on and the eye shades, that's a different story. They'll just pop out and go, ain't nothing happening in here, you know? Yeah. So what will happen is that we will start to realize more and more that not only is the setting and environment important, but also our being in the environment. You know, what are we doing? Are we just lying down, on the ground, or are we interacting? Are we dancing? Are we walking through the forest? All of that kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah, completely. I don't know if you know, but I taught yoga at an ayahuasca retreat center and saw how much of a difference it made for people, not only in the ayahuasca ritual, but also in the yoga. So in the ayahuasca ritual, because it's such a somatic experience that you cannot ignore. I mean, some people can dissociate in the ayahuasca experience and they fly off into the crystal realms or whatever. But for a lot of people, it's like, oh my God, like they understand the power of the breath and how it is related to their feeling of energy in their body and all of that. So they'd come to the yoga sessions and I wouldn't have to do all the preamble about the mind, body and breath and energy and all that. I just showed them the technology and they immediately got it. It was incredible. Like the best yoga teaching experience I've ever had, because people were primed by the psychedelic experience they had the night before.
And then it feeds back the other way as well. So what happens is that as you do that kind of work that at least ostensibly seems to be focused on the body, when you go back into the ayahuasca experience, not only can you let go into the body sensations, whatever those happen to be, but also the ability to listen, to intercept in terms of like, well, what's actually going on inside of me? How are these processes working out? All of those skills that we can gather up When we then go into the psychedelic state, we can deploy some of those, or we can utilize some of those things. So it's exactly like here I am, the acid's kicking in, I'm starting to get quite nervous, that I seem to have taken more than I expected, I'm breathing higher and faster. Oh, I know, I'll just breathe slower and deeper, and I'll put my body into the right kind of position, physical attitude for this, or I'll move in some particular way, or whatever it happens to be. So yeah. It's the as above, so below. These two things feed off each other and support each other as we go through the experience.
Yeah, completely. And when you're talking about helping people who tend to dissociate from the body, taking a lower dose and going for a walk, it makes me think that, I think one of the reasons why people dissociate is because the body doesn't feel like a safe place due to things that happened in their past experience, right? And so their defense is already online. Like, I just escape into my head or into my imagination or whatever, past or future, whatever it is. So that idea of befriending the body before introducing the psychedelic is quite important to me. And I think it's something that I always recommend when people come to me for consultation, before they have the experience. It's like, do any kind of practice you can just to be more attuned to your body, to feel like you can trust the natural processes of the body. Body knows how to breathe. The heart is beating. All of that is always functioning, and you can participate in it. You can help it out. You can support, self-regulation of the nervous system and all that. You can engage with that process, which is giving you life. And that's a big one for people.
It is. And I think that it's interesting because I mentioned briefly in passing this idea of the default mode network, this kind of state, the null state, that's often called the task null state, the state where we're not doing anything. So you put someone in an fMRI scanner and you look at what's going on, and you see, the vision stuff is connected to other vision bits of the brain, and the auditory stuff is connected to other auditory bits of the brain. And there's a couple of major sort of crossings over subloops of memory and association and so on. But I often think that the default mode network is probably erroneously named, because I suspect that for the vast majority of human history, and undoubtedly and very likely prehistory, we were not living in the kind of atomized, isolated, individual, and often, unfortunately, fearful kind of spaces that many people sadly inhabit. We were with a group of 150, 200 individuals, a smaller group on occasion, and occasionally in larger groups when we met for festival. And we would basically be in communion with our people. Yeah, that's how it would be. So yes, of course, there were those practices like going off, vision questing, or going off on a vigil, sitting out, all of those kinds of things. But actually being atomized and on your own and separated, that was pretty unusual. That was not a thing that by and large one would do in many, many cultural kind of settings. And so, yeah, I think that this different set of understandings about how, not just how we are as individuals, but how we are as beings that exist within this kind of wider community. And it's really evident when you look at something like addiction. When you look at addiction and you realize that addiction is a consequence of suffering, and suffering that, generally speaking, is to do with a lack of connection. And the lack of connection can be for any number of reasons. It can be economic, it can be because of trauma. That means that it feels dangerous for people to reach out and make connection. It can be all kinds of different reasons. But when we're disconnected, we suffer. And when we suffer, we try to mitigate our suffering. And sometimes we think that booze might be a good move, or lots of chocolate biscuits, or lots of candy, whatever. And we know that those things can easily become highly problematic for people. Yeah. So trying to look at, for example, addiction and say, well, actually, this is not primarily about chemistry. Either the exogenous chemistry of the stuff, it's the badness is not the suffering is not located in the diamorphine, in the heroin, and the suffering is not the result even necessarily of primarily of a genetic predisposition, or certainly not to do with the failure of the moral fiber of this individual. It's to do with their context. You put the rat in the box on its own, it presses the lever till it's completely off its head. That's because it's one rat on its own, in a box, has no idea when it's going to get out, and it's a social creature. Humans, hey, look, just the same, just the same.
Yeah, I think it's a great point about the so-called default mode network. It's not default to the human being, like the natural human being, but default to the civilized, industrialized, consumerized human who often, like you said, just feels so isolated. And even if we have a family, it's called a nuclear family for a reason, because it's a small little cell that's existing mostly on its own. And why the anxiety? Why the depression? Well, because that's not actually the default mode for humans to be. We're supposed to be in the kind of soup of interconnectivity, not just with our tribe mates, but also with the natural world. Because for most of human existence, the natural world was seen as alive. There was a relationship of reciprocity. We understood that we exist because it exists. And so there's no separation, and we owe something back to it, which is why all the early gods were nature gods, and all of that. So psychedelics can help awaken us to that. But if we then return back to this kind of society where we're all living in these tiny little cells, walking around on concrete all day long, surrounded by metal and glass, only seeing ourselves reflected back to us, or images from advertising, you're right back in it. And so you got to do another retreat in the jungle in a couple months. You
This
haven't
is,
really fixed the fundamental issue.
and this is really where the big work is, because, like, there's plenty of people now exploring the psychedelic experience, either through medicines or through other kind of techniques, these mind altering, mind expanding experiences, or however we want to frame them, and that's cool. But I'm reminded of that thing that Terence McKenna said about bringing back a middle-size idea. Bringing back something that's an achievable thing. Like, Terence has got this great rap. It's going to be in his YouTube catalog somewhere. He basically says there's big ideas where you go, wow, everything's one. Whoa, you can't really say much about that. Or little ideas like, isn't it amazing how your finger fits just up your nose? And then a middle-sized idea is like, oh, I could do this. This is like it's like going fishing. Yeah, you don't want a whale, you don't want a minnow. You want like something you can actually eat. So the next big thing is going to be like, how do we take this and how do we change our cultures and our ways of living so that economically, socially, politically, we can start to create networks and of which allow us to be in some way closer to that way of living that is built into us in our DNA. This is what we want. One of the things I think that the pandemic has done is it's increased the connectivity through things like Zoom and all of that kind of stuff, and that's really helpful. That's I think a very, very useful, beneficial kind of side of this, so that there's a sense in which we have even more awareness of the kind of global digital community that we exist in. We've done this remarkable thing of, and it's not without its problems, of course, but spreading out this real-time network of digital communication throughout the world. But we also need to think about like how we do our shopping, how we go to the store, like where do we live? How many people live in the same building? What's going to happen to us when we die? Who are our caregivers when we're old? All of this kind of stuff. This is where I think that there will be, I hope, in the next, over the course of the next decades, the emergence of new ways of living. When acid first started happening in actually all the way across the world, but especially in, say, North America, there was this great kind of like back to the land movement. Hey guys, let's all go off and set up a farm somewhere. And that worked, to a greater or lesser degree. But the point I think about it was there was a desire to transform this experience, which is in some respects primarily internal, into an inhabited reality. And so the great work, the real challenge, the middle-sized idea is going to be like, okay, so how can we do this? And there will be, I hope, many, many different strategies to do that. And they will vary across, time and different communities and so on. But this is probably one of the things that we really should be focusing our attention on. And we should all, I think, be thinking about like, just how we can change those things a little. You know, even if it's just to the extent of, one of the things that I think the pandemic did, certainly in this country, and I guess it happened elsewhere, is because lots of people were, you know, in their homes, they got to know their neighbors a little better. They got to know, like, you know, the old dude down at the corner who might need to get some, he might need to go to the store for this person, you know, because
Hmm.
otherwise they're not going to get any food. And like, you know, most human beings, social creatures, we want to reach out, we want to help. So we can build on that, and I hope that we're able to do that in a good way.
Mm. Yeah, you remember when I said that there might be a time where I got to take a little break? Now's the time.
Now's the time.
Just give me a minute.
Sure, man. Sure, no problem.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. When I published my last book, Yoga and Plant Medicine, it was in 2019, so pre-pandemic, and I was able to go on a little self-funded book tour across Canada, and I made it down to New York. And so I was meeting with groups who were often organized by the local psychedelic society, which I love that kind of grassroots movement that's happening all over North America, and I think in the UK too, at least. Um, and, what was kind of like the topic of conversation was this psychedelic renaissance that was happening, and a lot of excitement about the therapeutic use of psychedelics and the kind of mainstreaming of it and all that. And what kind of came to me as I met with a couple of these groups was, and it was something that I talked about with everyone, but if this is indeed a renaissance, so a rebirth, we have to think about what kind of culture or environment this new thing is being born into.
Yeah.
Because if we think biologically, the culture in which an organism grows up in, we know how much it affects what it then becomes. And so if we stick with the metaphor of the psychedelic renaissance coming through the mainstreaming and therapeutic use of it, if we don't pay attention to the kind of culture that it's emerging into, we're going to end up with a kind of monster, I think, or at least something that is really dysfunctional, because the culture at large is dysfunctional. And I can say that, the whole Western culture pretty much, which has now gone global thanks to a lot of the technology you mentioned before. It's kind of this monoculture that is taking over the world, which is really sad. But so that's kind of like my warning is like, let's really pay attention to what it's emerging into. And we're already seeing now a lot of the kind of corporate players coming into it. Everyone's trying to rush to market here in Canada, in the US, because things are starting to open up legally. And what I've been kind of encouraging people to do is just kind of slow down and think about how we're bringing psychedelics into the clinical environment. Are there things that we can learn from indigenous and even more modern neo-shamanic practitioners and traditions? Because the way it stands now, the clinical setting, the kind of mode of treatment, I think is missing quite a lot, which actually enacts or enables or catalyzes the healing process. Like it's actually some things I think are essential that are not in these kind of current clinical modes. So I've done some writing on this too recently, and I'm curious, someone like yourself who's also a practitioner, has experience with other kinds of rituals. Is there anything that you think is missing from the kind of current model for therapeutic treatment with psychedelics?
I think, okay, I mean, it's a really interesting and valuable point. I think that there's several ways to look at that. I mean, one is to do with accessibility. So one of the movements that I've been incredibly pleased to see flourishing in North America has been things like the legalized nature movements, and the movements to ensure that, as we perfectly reasonably understand that our medical professionals should have access to these medicines because they are valuable, that we also need to recognize that they are valuable not only as medicine in the clinical sense, but that they should be in some way or other accessible more broadly, so that it's not only clinicians who get to have the keys to the kingdom, right? So
Yeah.
that's like one of the first things for me was like, okay, I'm, you know, like people such as over here in the UK, Ben Sessa. Ben Sessa is a completely sound, amazing guy. He's a beautiful man doing really important work. And I'm really, really pleased that he is now in a position where he's done groundbreaking work on things like using MDMA to treat treatment-resistant alcoholism. And I also know that MDMA, and he would, and Ben and many others would acknowledge this, but MDMA is incredibly safe, particularly given the fact that we take it often under the worst possible circumstances. That is to say, it's in the criminalized culture with no control over dosage or purity or any of this kind of stuff. But it's also a perfectly reasonable thing for people to go out and dance and rave and have a beautiful time with their friends. And that can be thought of as healing, or it can be thought of as a valuable thing for us to have access to in our lives, you know. So I wouldn't want to see the psychedelics become purely seen as a medicine in the kind of the Western sense that gets used. I think in fairness to a lot of those kind of clinicians, a lot of those people who are actually kind of working with the material, with clients or with patients, a lot of those people are really aware of this, you know. I mean, remember talking to Professor Torsten Passy, who wrote the book, The Science of Microdosing Psychedelics, and talking to him about a conference that he went to in Hamburg, I think it was Hamburg or Berlin, something like this, and how the big presentation that all the clinicians wanted to go to was essentially something along the lines of, doesn't matter how we fix people up, if we slot them back into the matrix and it looks like it does, there's no point. There's no point. So there was this big kind of discussion with all these, you know, high level kind of professionals, all these psychotherapists and psychologists and psychiatrists and so on, saying there is no point fixing people up, so we just put them back on the battlefield. Like, why are we doing this? We've got to have like more systemic ways of dealing with this as a culture. We have to look at things like if we look at something like resource use, and we look at about, you know, how much stuff have we got, how much power, how much money have we got, we know that anyone who's ever baked a cherry cake knows that inevitably, just because of mathematics, some people will get more cherries in their slice than other people will get in their slice of cake. That's just how things group together. And in capitalism, what happens is that money tends to gravitate towards more money. So one of the issues here is like, okay, we have a model of taxation. Maybe there are other models out there too. How do we ensure that we have a what feels to as many people as possible as an equitable way of distributing resource? You know, we know that this is like a thing. So we have to work on those kind of models. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to do because it's such a big system. Trying to even find routes through it that where we could make these changes probably means that as individuals we have to come up with, you know, whatever our individual strategy is, and that could include anything from like who we vote into power through to where we buy our food, through to the kind of clothes that we source for ourselves and for our families and so on. So it's not a question of there being like for me one great answer. I think the thing is that the psychedelic experience kind of suggests to me that multiplicity of approach is probably the way forward, and we probably need to resist the creation of monopolizing structures. Even if we go back to the ancient world and we look at the Temple of Eleusis that you know existed for over 1,000 years, one of the downfalls of Eleusis was that they had a monopoly on the psychedelic, as far as we can tell. Pretty much, there's a couple of suggestions as to.
Yeah, I think the mystery migrated. There's definitely evidence for that.
Yeah, I mean, but I think the thing about it is that this was the kind of. I think it's fairly certain. I'm personally fairly convinced that this was the psychedelic heart of like the ancient world. It was the primary mystery and so on. But it was only one place, and I think that just like with the whole thing about psychedelic medicine, I would like to see clinicians being able to use this stuff, and I would like to see. Whether it's like going right the way back to Politics of Ecstasy by Timothy Leary, where he talks about a licensing model. You know, you got a car, It's a dangerous thing. You need a license. You need to know how to use this stuff. You got acid. It's a dangerous thing. You need a license. You need to, I mean, maybe there's a model like that out there. I don't know. But I think definitely we need to ensure that we don't get a situation where the moksha medicine becomes the soma of Brave New World. That much is evident, you know,
Yeah.
and it is entirely feasible, particularly within the capitalist culture, which has, not because of any great conspiracy, but because of an emergent property of it, it's atomized us so that it can then sell us back things that apparently are going to make us feel better when actually we're just disconnected from each other and our material world. And I felt that very keenly. I remember in 2019 when I was a participant on a psilocybin trial in London, like, okay, the people who ran the session were amazing, absolutely amazing. You know, this was the prequel before they started working with people with treatment-resistant depression, which they're now doing. They held the session absolutely brilliantly, and bless them, they actually kind of came to me afterwards and said, like, is there anything you could suggest? And I was like, no, dudes, like there was one thing, but everything else is like totally spot on as far as I could see. And then I got on a bus in central London after I'd come down, and it's like, boom, here I am, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not going to be just my experience. That will be the experience of all those other patients, many of whom, and in fact, one of the people on the trial that I was in had never taken any psychedelic ever. And yes, they made sure that there was a taxi and that their partner was coming to pick them up, and they did what they could. But nevertheless, stepping out into, like, you know, January nighttime London with all of its noise and all of its stuff, it's like, okay, so we really need to think about this. We need to think about this because, like Torsten Passy and his colleagues were saying, if we heal people and then we just plug them straight back in and they find themselves again a rat in a box on their own, we'll just have the same story again. And
Yeah.
that's, I guess, why those of us who are in a reasonably privileged and empowered position, that's why we have to really start kind of coming up with some strategies for this, like, and that's everything: how we do our architecture, how we raise our children, how we do teaching. Like, I do a lot of work in kind of educational settings, and the way that we group our young people by year of manufacture, and then we teach them a whole bunch of stuff, much of which is, you know, utterly irrelevant and pointless, some of which is I mean, kids in the British Isles get to learn about, like, World War II and the Nazis at least twice, if not three times, between the ages of like 5 and 16. So it's like we teach about that, but we don't teach about things like how in World War One the war nearly came to an end in 1914 because 2/3 of the people who were on opposing sides ended up playing football and hanging out with each other. Like, we don't teach that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting. That's interesting. So I think that there needs to be also a shift in emphasis in terms of, we have to be able to imagine our utopia. We have to be able to focus our attention on the good. We have to be able to see where these positive changes may be made, because it's like placebo or like the nocebo process. If we continuously tell us these messages about how we're bad and we're fallen and it's all falling apart, yeah, man, there's stuff to be done. That for certain is sure. But we also have to have a vision, you know, and we have to try and to find these middle-sized ideas which we can use to actually accomplish our vision in some sense. And I haven't got a straightforward and glib answer to that. You know, it's a work in progress, and there will be many approaches, and there will be many failures. But if I look at the story of things like the Whole Earth Catalog, the Back to the Land movement in America in the kind of 1960s, 70s, and so on, I can see in that people attempting to live out, however imperfectly and in however flawed a manner, the vision that they had from their experiences of taking LSD. And I can see with the free party scene that existed in the British Isles, and even some of the outlaw parties that are happening now, you know, people wanting to gather together to dance because of what happened with what's sometimes called the second summer of love in, like, like 88, 89, something like this in the British Isles. Like, we have to find these ways to kind of come together, not just in the psychedelic state, but in kind of other ways too. And this is happening, you know, people are looking at like conflict resolution with, like, you know, using things like ayahuasca and using other psychedelics between warring tribes, let's call them, you know, and this is really, really important and vital work. So I haven't got a simple answer to that one, Brian, but I think maybe that fleshes out some kind of the content about where we might go.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that you talk about the importance of the context in which we're trying to do the healing work. There's a couple of basic assumptions in there, though, that raise little yellow flags for me. I guess the first is that we're still stuck in this idea that the problem is in you and me and not in the world, first of all. So I want to hear the mainstream medical, whoever, authorities, doctors on the ground, just speaking more about that. And I know one of my mentors, Gabor Mate, his next book is kind of all about that. And he's got a great platform and people listen to him. So I'm hoping that that starts to expand the conversation in that area. Because like that was something that James Hillman came to toward the end of his life too. And he was talking about that a lot. That was the main focus of his lectures in the 90s and early 2000s, I think, was the nature of our cities and bringing more beauty, more public space, more opportunity for communitas into the cities we live in as a really kind of easy way to begin. Get the architects and city planners on board. Let's take them to the jungle.
It's completely right. It's completely right, and it's a very, very well made and very essential point. Like I joke to people and say, look, if you haven't got anxiety, depression in this part of the early 21st century, you're not paying attention. Like, of course, like why would you not have it? Why the ice caps are melting? The species, destruction of species. Huge economic inequality, like abuse, all kinds of stuff going on. I think it's important, though, to be able to kind of keep a vision of what may be possible and may be possible for all of us. And then we just do the little things we can do. Like I work in a gallery, yeah, and around the gallery we've got like we've got a gardener who's paid for by the local community, and we're getting our gardener to plant food people can just take away and plants that we're going to use to do dyeing sort of tablecloths. And the tablecloths are going to be put together by people from a women's refuge. And there's a whole bunch of other kind of like target groups who we know have had a really hard time over the last year. We're working with those people and we're going to throw a feast. That's what we're going to do. And it's only a tiny thing. Yeah, it's only a tiny thing. But it means that there's a bunch of people people who've been abused, people who are homeless, people, really kind of, I work with things like, there's a group of young carers that I work with. So kids who are looking after like their parents and even grandparents who are unwell. So we get those kids in and we do some art with them and we give them an opportunity to do something really good. And we do like quality stuff as well. This isn't just like, hey, here's some paper, do a drawing. This is like, we get good artists to come in. We work with them. They get something they can be proud of. They get something they can go, hey, I did this. This is amazing. We did this. It's amazing. Yeah. So like that's just a little kind of micro version of what I get up to. And many people can do this, and many people are doing this and continue to do this, because you're right. Unless we change the environment, the locus of the problem with that rat in the box is not with the rat. Yeah, it's the box.
It's the box, yeah. And it's not the substance either.
Nope. It's the box it's in.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. And when I was on that book tour talking about, let's pay attention to the culture that the psychedelic renaissance is happening in and all that, where I ended up with it was kind of a call to arms, is that, well, what we can do actually is acknowledge that there's something very wrong with the dominant culture. But that doesn't make us powerless, and we don't need to wait for massive changes to happen, but we can create microcultures that are healthy. And if we create enough of those, maybe they start to become more dominant, like these cells all merging together and become one bigger cell. And so that's what we can do. And we can all do that on some level. And I think about even how that can affect change in a very real way. And one of the ways that we've seen this happen is, I think in like the 1950s and 60s, architects and developers started to pay attention to natural flows of movement with human beings. So they would like grid out the sidewalk where everyone's supposed to walk. And of course, everyone walks right across the lawn. And some, observant and intelligent and humble planner said, wait a minute, maybe that's actually where we should put the sidewalk. like taking the kind of the cow path idea, like, well, where do
Yeah,
the
yeah,
cows want to go, and we'll just make that the path, right? And so that's like just a small example of how our actions on the grassroots level, sticking with the metaphor nicely,
mm,
can affect change. Like maybe if enough of us start doing it, the powers that be will start to pay attention and go, yeah, maybe it's better for us to go with the flow, actually.
yeah. That example, which I think sometimes referred to as paths of desire, which is a lovely poetic phrase for exactly that. But also, I guess that the other thing that I take heart from is again to dive back to the oeuvre of the fabulous Terence McKenna, peace be upon him, is this idea of we're not dropping out here, we're infiltrating and taking over. And one of the things that I see, and I see this because there are many friends of mine who work in positions of um, uh, power in academia or in policy making, or in like a variety of different areas where the normalizing of a lot of these ideas and the cultural conversation about these ideas and conversations that we're having. Okay, so we're like weirdos with long hair and stuff, but there's a possibility that somebody who is not a weirdo with long hair will see this and go, oh, they seem to have a thing going on. And those conversations, I think, they affect change. And it's like if you look at something like uh, racism, for example. Now, we know that this is hugely problematic, and I have the situation where, like, I'm a white dude, right? So I don't actually experience very much of this in a direct and personal way, but I know it happens, and I've seen evidence of it, and so on. And I remember as a kid, like growing up in the '70s, and like to talk in really unpleasant ways about other people because of the amount of like melanin that they've got in their skin was still a thing. It was cool. And now I've worked for many years in organizations, local authority organizations, arts and cultural organizations, and commercial organizations where there are explicit policies saying this is not on. And not only should you not do this stuff, but you are actively encouraged to challenge racism, as an example, when that happens. Now, that may seem like maybe it's just like window dressing and it's like blah, 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 blah. But it's also a cultural change. The position of women in my culture, in my lifetime, has changed substantially. The So these changes happen, and they happen often on a generational basis. Like, we won't see this kind of utopian ideal, and I hope very much that our children or our children's children do. That would be amazing.
Mm.
But these incremental and gradual changes are out there. We should notice those as well. Like gratitude practice, we always notice where the pain is, but we can deal with the pain more successfully if we notice where the good is as well. And if we look at those cultural changes and we look at those people who we now know, like people I grew up with, people who are friends of mine now, who are in these positions of authority, and we look at these kind of changes, it may not be perfect, but the things that we see that are pushing in a direction that we think is helpful, we support, and in whatever way, whether it's through how we vote, what we buy, all of these kind of things, we slowly gather these things in the right kind of direction. It's the only game in town. It's the best we can do. Revolutions, big revolutions, have a habit of eating their children. And if the whole biosphere kind of collapses and human beings are reduced to small bands of hunter-gatherers ranging around the planet, as long as they remember that the mushrooms are there, that'll be fine too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as you're talking about that, the phrase kept popping up in my head, like everyday magic. Like all of these choices that we make every day affect change, uh, in a very small way often, but then on a bigger scale, if there's enough of us doing that same thing. Like, remember even when it was a big thing just to get people stop littering, and now we've got people separating their garbage out into organics and metals and plastics, and like that's all happened in my lifetime too.
If
And
I
even
think
that
about,
level of awareness where now it's culturally taboo to litter. Of course,
yeah,
people still do it, but they won't do it if you're looking,
yeah,
they'll do
yeah.
it secretly.
And if you look at something like the last pandemic that we had, so the HIV pandemic, Now that made, I was listening to a really interesting interview with one of the members of the Conservative government who was in post at the time when HIV really started to kind of happen. And it was really interesting to see how they had to deal with like talking about stuff like anal sex and condoms, which was completely like you cannot imagine like how totally off the map that was. But circumstances forced that, and then advocacy groups, queer identified groups, gay groups, medical professionals, all of this stuff led to the point where, like, now in my country, if two people of the same identified gender want to get married, then that's no big deal. It's not a big thing. Like it's like there are still, of course, people who raise an eyebrow, and some people even who would raise a fist. But by and large, the cultural conversation has moved on. Like if I
Mhm.
talk to my children about these kind of things, they're like, "What?
Yeah,
Really?
they can't
What?"
believe it.
And that's what I want. That's what I want. I want them to find it as completely almost impossible to understand, except as a historical curiosity, as
Hmm.
I might any number of other unpleasant things in history that I'm aware of, in terms of the relationship that one community has with another, you know?
Yeah,
So yeah, I mean, I think that uh, there is hope. We should hold fast to that. We should keep our vision clear. We should focus our attention on those things that are good and that we can put our energy behind. We should, of course, be mindful of the challenges and the difficulties, and we need to be thoughtful about that stuff. But we also need to really have that vision and find whatever tiny ways we have of making that vision come true.
totally. Well, circling back around to imagination, that's really why it's become so central in my work, is because we need that vision. And without imagination, you can only have a received vision from someone else, a secondhand vision. And what I want to do is kind of use the collective wisdom and get everybody awakening their visionary capacity and then getting together and see just how much it lines up. Like our version of utopia that comes to us in our visionary state or in our dream, I'm going to guarantee, because of where that's arising from, the collective unconscious, that if we get together and compare notes, that we're all thinking about a lot of the same things. And I've noticed in the shamanic circles that I've been doing is the remarkable amount of agreement between people on what has become important to them over the past few years. Simple things like we get together, and I pushed the boundaries on when we could get together in person because I felt it was important and necessary. And people would just come in, and there'd only be 10. We're socially distanced. Everyone's in their own reclining chair because I use a clinic, community acupuncture studio. So they were already set up for that. People come in and they would go, I ask, well, what's your intention? Why did you come? What are you looking for? And they'd be like, oh my God, it just feels so good to be in a room with other people and just to have this time together.
Mm.
Like
Mm.
like you said, connection is so essential and fundamental, and it's something that we take for granted or we think we're getting through electronic means until we don't have the real life connection. Then we go, oh my God, that's actually what I needed.
At its best, let's hope, enchant for, pray for the idea that as we come through the pandemic and as we come out of that, I hope, and as people start to make those physical connections, if we can be doing our own kind of personal work, if we can be doing our body work, meditation, whatever it is, so that we can have the capacity to deal with something that is undoubtedly going to be challenging, and we can deal with all of the differences and strange similarity of the stories that we encounter, then we can remember how being in communion with other people is really what it's all about, and maybe with such a time of enforced isolation for many people, that as we come back into that, we can really revel and enjoy and really notice how important and beautiful this is, you know?
Oh man, I'm so with you. Let's make that the focus of our prayers, songs, chants. Um, yeah. you know, I know you're a tarot guy too, right? So
Yeah.
sometimes I pull a card before a conversation, and usually I don't share it. But the way that our conversation has gone, I can't help but to share this one with you.
What have we got?
So I pulled the Sun card.
Hey.
Right? Do you want to
Oh,
talk about this card for people who can't see it?
okay, so we've got there the sun. Beautiful, beautiful. So the classic image of two people, usually two children, standing maybe inside a walled garden, maybe outside the wall of the city, with this beautiful sunshine coming down them. These children playing together, these people being together in the warmth and the opening of the light. Yeah, that's the sun.
That's the image we're talking about, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I love in the Marseille deck too, there's this kind of like weird imagery, but it's almost like naively weird. Like they weren't trying like in the in the Smith Coleman deck or whatever, or like Aleister Crowley's deck, they're kind of trying to be weird. They're throwing all the Kabbalah stuff in there and everything, right? But there's something about the Marseille that I love because it just seems like kind of folk art. Like it just
Yeah.
seems like it is what it is. But in this one, there are these drops that seem to be moving from that communion of the innocence up to the sun. So the sun's rays are cascading down, and at the same time, there's this watery nourishment up to the sun, which, I mean, that's the whole thing, isn't it? That spirit of reciprocity. We are not alone in the cosmos.
Mm.
Yeah, together, better together, and all that.
All one under the sun.
All one under the sun. Well, I had other questions, but man, that's just it. Like we got to end it there. It's beautiful.
Brian, thank you so much. Really appreciate talking to you, my friend. That was very, very cool. Nice one.
Yeah, no, I've enjoyed speaking to you too. Now, before we go, people want to find out more about Julian Vayne and your work. What's the best place?
Conveniently these days, julianvayne.com, VAYNE.com. And there's like links from there to like loads of different stuff, loads of books. And, I do like online teaching, bits of mentoring for people. And when the pandemic, inshallah passes, then, like face-to-face stuff, talks, workshops, blah, 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 blah. I've got a blog that I've run for about, it's getting on for like a decade now. So there's links out from there as well. But julianvayne.com, easiest way to find me and the stuff. And, friendly and lovely people can check me out on like Instagram, old school Facebook, or all of that kind of stuff. And Brian,
Yeah,
thank you so much. Really lovely conversation, my friend. Very, very good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
yeah. Thank you, brother.
Hallelujah.